The answer is not to say I'm not going to care about my appearance.
Mhm.
I think,
This woman has spent nearly 2 decades studying the relationship between fashion, femininity, and power. Her research asks questions most people never think to ask about the clothes they wear, and I think today's conversation is going to change the way you think about fashion and glowing up entirely. She is a co editor of the International Journal of Fashion Studies and the author of Poiret, Dior, and Schiaparelli. This is Dr. Ilya Parkins. Today's conversation is going to be a little bit different from my usual videos. I think I mentioned this when I first contacted you after I read your book, Poiret, Dior, and Schiaparelli. What I hope to get out of our conversation, Dr. Perkins, is to kind of explore the unspoken societal and cultural implications of this whole glow up notion through your research and how that affects women now, which is perfect because according to my social media analytics, about 90% of my viewers are women. So,
oh, good. Okay.
you think,
My name's Ilya Parkins. I am a professor in gender, women, and sexuality studies at the University of British Columbia on the Okanagan campus. And I've been there for almost 19 years now.
the only thing that's going through my mind is the consequences of buying that piece of clothing. Technically, I've been a consumer my entire life, so I probably can't um, intuitively notice the bigger picture. So I was wondering, why should we care about studying these fashion designers and the narrative that they're trying to push?
Yeah, I think it's important to do that because if we don't study it, we tend to take it for granted. So I worked on in my older book, the one you're talking about, I worked on some designers from the first half of the 20th century. And what I was interested in was how they were presenting themselves and how their self-presentation actually had implications for thinking about the women they were dressing. So that in a sense, the way that they wrote about themselves and talked about themselves gave us insight into what we tend to call the imaginary of the women that they wanted to dress, right? And that because fashion is such a powerful cultural phenomenon, when we can get inside the minds and kind of imaginaries of designers who have a hold on people and who are very well respected and popular, then we get a really interesting angle into the way that the society sees femininity more broadly, I would say.
So on page 2, you mentioned the biblical story of Adam and Eve, and I'm gonna quote you if that's okay.
Sure.
As Ephraim Ceylon observes, since the fall is blamed on the woman, the links between sin, body, woman, and clothes are easily forged. This association is a tenacious one and is part of the reason why feminists have had such a conflicted relationship to fashion as a concept and a practice. From my current understanding after reading this book, this quote stood out to me the most.
Mhm.
It pretty much shows why fashion has been like a massive headache in the
Yeah.
context of Western society. I was wondering, how did that specific interpretation come to be?
I mean, I think we can look at the history of the ways that women and femininity have been written and talked about and thought about and depicted in art for many centuries now, where they've been seen as sort of seductresses and temptresses, concerned with the surface, concerned with shallow things, and concerned with deceit, right? So, an idea that women make themselves up and beautify themselves in order to be deceitful. And so there's just a huge voluminous in what we might call Western culture. So, like the Euro American cultural heritage, a huge bunch of cultural production that shows that there's a kind of suspicion of women being deceitful and using beauty and adornment and that kind of thing as strategies to do harm, essentially, especially harm toward men. So that's an insight that has been really important in my work, trying to understand the relationship between fashion and femininity. And I think what it acts as is a bit of a double bind, right? Because we demonize women, in fact, for wanting to be beautiful and paying attention to their quote unquote surface and that kind of thing. But at the same time, we demonize them when they don't, right? So that kind of thing leads to it's a really um, unfortunate place to put feminine people, right? Where they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't in terms of beauty.
Are there any recurring historical events you've noticed in our modern society, especially with the information age, social media, or just day-to-day interactions?
I would say that social media is huge. Social media acts to funnel our understanding and knowledge of ourselves and the world through visual lens, right? Because it's so much about images. And I think that one of the things that has done is made us hyper aware. And I think especially younger people, hyper aware of being watched and being scrutinized, being um, the subject of a photo, that kind of thing. And there's an interesting way in which people internalize that and come to be scrutinizing themselves. So there's a phenomenon by Michel Foucault, this idea of the panopticon, which is a way of talking about being seen from all angles all the time, being visible. And I think that has really happened. Younger women, so women under 30, sort of who've grown up with the internet and with social media, bear the brunt of that. You always have the sense that you are on display somehow. That's exhausting.
In your book, you mentioned as feminist theories have shown the tendency to exclude women from and even to oppose them to the category of the new was endemic in the arts, politics, and social and cultural theory. What does emerge that might be of interest to feminist theory, though, is that constellations of past and present are often understood to be embodied in fashion. Is there a primary example of that feminist theory that you feel is most relevant? Are there any particular theories that you've studied extensively?
Anybody who's been writing in the last 15 to 20 years about time in feminist theory and in queer theory has been really influential because they've really identified the ways that we categorize and value peoples based on how we place them in time, right? Are they in the present? Are they somehow stuck in a past, which is not a good place to be in our way of thinking? Are they aligned with the future? So there's a whole range of people in feminist and queer theory who've been writing about time, and what they've found is that some exciting things, some of the more optimistic are when there are multiple kinds of times at once. And so, that's what I find interesting with fashion. And this was specifically, when I was writing this was specifically about early 20th century stuff. And women were being imagined to be mostly kind of stuck in the past. They were like archaic and that kind of thing. But what fashion did, and this is what I found so interesting about it in the early 20th century, in the global north, let's say, is that fashion actually, because fashion is very of the moment and because fashion was seen to be so associated with women, it was a way of actually bringing them into the present. So it was getting them away from this perception that they were in the past. So for me, what's interesting is being able to juxtapose multiple kinds of registers of time. And there's a whole bunch of feminist theorists who write about that. People like Elizabeth Freeman and Jack Halberstam and Heather Love.
I wanted to ask, what is modernity and what is modern femininity?
So modernity, as I was talking about it in this book, very much meant a period before now. And so when I was writing about modernity, I was thinking about the period really from in the 19th century and the pre-Second World War period, I would say. So let's roughly say from 1800 to 1950, uh, roughly. And this is a period when you have a really massive acceleration of the sense of time that people have in their daily lives, because you have communication technology that makes it easier to communicate with people who it would take forever to communicate with before. You have the development of visual imagery all of a sudden everywhere by the late 19th, early 20th century. You have industry picking up that allows things to be manufactured more quickly. You have people moving into cities. And so what you have in modernity is this sense of a tempo speeding up, crowds and noise and chaos and speed and just movement, I would say. And what's interesting about modern femininity specifically is that it has a kind of ambivalent relationship to that. Sometimes women were imagined to be outside of that, but often they were kind of shuttling in and being parts of those crowds, being parts of those cities, uh, through their engagement with fashion. So they were kind of modern femininity is a kind of paradox where it's at once seen as outside of time and on the other hand, up to the minute, right? And I think that's an interesting contradiction.
Let's talk about the infamous Paul Poiret.
Yes.
Yeah, well, what a guy, right?
Right,
Like,
a guy, not my fave.
can you tell me a little bit more about him through your research?
Sure. So he was a designer who became famous in the first decade of the 20th century. That's when he first launched his fashion design business.
Mhm.
And in the period right before the First World War, he was extremely influential. Um, he was one of the most highly regarded haute couture designer. And he was interesting because not only did he design clothing, but he also designed a whole host of other things, or people in his orbit designed a whole host of other things, from wallpaper to home furnishings. What is interesting about him is that what he did and what he made his name doing was what he would call it, he revolutionized the silhouette of women's clothing. So
Yeah.
in the first decade of the 20th century, you had very corseted, very structured clothing. And it really, the dominant line in fashion was to really tighten around a woman's body. And what he did was introduce this silhouette that appeared to be very loose and flowing. Actually, you still needed to wear undergarments that would sort of do body shaping to get the effect, but it was a kind of loosening of everything, and more skin was shown and that kind of thing. I mean, in our contemporary terms, we wouldn't call it much skin, but certainly it was a loosening and a deconstriction, or it certainly looked that way, and that's what he became most famous for.
What kind of like vision was he trying to push?
He was trying to present himself as a genius, a master and connoisseur of all the arts. He was making He was doing costumes for famous ballets, working with visual artists. And it was a moment when he and others were trying to position fashion designers as the ultimate artists who had the most refined and um, advanced conception of beauty. So I find that as a scholar and a feminist scholar offensive on many levels, because it was a classic, like he thinks he knows beauty better than women,
Yeah.
right? So that's what he stands out for me
Mhm.
about.
And what happened after the First World War? What happened to his business? What happened to his work?
After the First World War, he had a resurgence in the 1920s, late 20s. He had a real resurgence and he started designing again, but it didn't last and his business went bankrupt. And he died in the early to mid 1930s. Things had really changed after the First World War. I mean, any historian will talk about that. The landscape was very, very different. And I actually think that he probably represented, in fact, I know he represented an older version of femininity than was sort of stylish and on point in the 1920s.
I see. Fashion media claims to kind of celebrate body freedom and casual comfort. Yet, as we've seen in Hollywood or any other entertainment industries in general, and even in our regular day-to-day lives, women can be under intense pressure to achieve a perfect natural look through hidden labor like filler and Botox, plastic surgery. So, how does Poiret's paradox help us understand this modern double standard where we are told to like look natural but also effortlessly beautiful?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head and made a really great connection yourself. You don't need me to tell you that what he did was provided a kind of template for that, right? That said, um, that sort of held up some vision of natural beauty, but in fact, he was shaping it, he was sculpting it really, really in a really controlling way, actually. And I think we could probably apply that to our contemporary moment, right? It's not one person who is controlling anything the way that we might want to say Poiret wanted to do. The complex of influences that women are dealing with as they try to self-fashion, maybe we could say it looks something like that, in fact. So that was a really great connection you're making.
Thank you. And we are introduced to Coco Chanel's rival, Elsa Schiaparelli. Schiaparelli writes her memoir in third person, and you
Mm.
also mentioned that in your book as well. And it's I found that to be empowering, telling your narrative like that. You mentioned that she also writes, I merely know Scap by hearsay. I've only seen her in a mirror, which is also really interesting and a really poetic way of describing herself. So,
Yeah.
um, can you tell me a little bit more about her? Like why she also narrates herself in third person like that?
Can't get into her brain. She's
Yeah.
long been gone. But my suggestion in the book, and I stand by this all these years later, is that it's a means of preserving her own privacy and her own interiority, right?
Mhm.
She's an interesting celebrity, right? And she offers a sense of somebody who is navigating scrutiny and trying to figure out strategies for preserving something of herself in the face of that scrutiny. Um, and so when she says something like, I only can only see Scap in the mirror, that's a way of saying Scap is a public figure, right? I don't know her. She's not me, right? She's a construction that I've presented for the world. And so she's really adept at separating her interiority, herself, from what she needs to present to the world. Um, I think that's really interesting. I think it's really hard to do now. So because of those kinds of reasons I was talking about earlier about this idea that we have access to everybody all the time. So she lived in an era in which that wasn't necessarily the case. She lived in an earlier era of celebrity, and she figured out a way to withhold something of herself so that she could preserve her own privacy, I would say.
I I don't think I mentioned this yet, but I also found that you wrote a paper on her and something about like glamorous silence.
Hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. And I think some of that paper ended up in the book too.
Uh-huh.
And what I was doing there was I worked with the concept of glamour
Mhm.
um, to try and understand her silence and that withholding that she had about her own selfhood. And what I found is that glamour is a concept that denotes distance, right? It's a concept that actually keeps the viewer at bay. Like we may adore and be enchanted by things that are glamorous, but it is not something we can really touch in any real way. And I mean touch metaphorically, right? It stays distant from us. And so I think cultivating glamour is a mode of doing what I was saying she does in general, of keeping people at a distance and preserving her interiority.
Okay, so to quote you again, Carol S. Gould, in fact, renders glamour as an expression of self. She argues that it flows from a person's own interior mode of experience. And then, since mystery and secrets suggest depth, a carefully elaborated theory of glamour does not naively reduce glamour to a surface effect. Rather, glamour can denote interiority and intellect. Did I just read the same line twice? What can we learn from Schiaparelli about glamour? How do we apply that into our own lives?
I think we can learn that people who we experience as glamorous
Mhm.
are often cultivating that strategically, and that it's a kind of work. Um, there's a scholar named Elizabeth Wissinger who's written about what she's called glamour labor, and
Mhm.
she did work with models, and she wrote about the kind of the work that they had to engage in to appear glamorous all the time.
Mhm.
And I think Schiaparelli was an early version of that. And we get to see that work pretty neatly in her autobiography, Shocking Life, where she does that distancing. She talks about herself in the third person in order to, like, she has benefits. It's in order to preserve her interiority, her privacy, and all of that kind of thing. It's not that it doesn't give her benefits, but it's work. Absolutely. So I think that's what we can take from it. And from there, we can extend to think about all kinds of self-fashioning as work. And you hinted at that yourself when you talked about the labor of Botox and, just, all the things that women tend to do these days in order to keep up appearances. And so I think that Schiaparelli really turns us toward how that's a kind of work. And that's become a really important um, through line in my more recent research as well.
Was it ever revealed like what kind of person she is and what her private self was like in comparison to her public image?
I never have seen much that gets at that actually. What I've seen when other people write about her and who were her contemporaries and knew her, there's a real investment in that myth. So I feel like even the way that she circulated in the world when she would go to a party, say, with a lot of people, was still upholding that myth. So yes, I'm sure her own daughter would have known and any lover she had and her immediate family, but it's not very accessible. It's not archived really. So.
Yeah, she was really good at that, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was.
Another thing I wanted to ask was, what was her, can you tell me a little bit more about her work and what was her impact on feminism?
hmm So her work, what she's best known for is collaborations with surrealist artists, really famous ones, including Salvador Dali and Jean Cocteau and folks like that. And what's interesting about that is that it did very unexpected things with women's bodies and with like presentations of fashionable women. So they became kind of enigmatic. A lot of her pieces, just like if you think of a Salvador Dali painting, which I'm sure you can imagine, they're odd. There's weird things floating around. There's bananas. There's clocks in the sky. It's very difficult. It's illegible on some level, right? And she did that with women's bodies, which is quite interesting. So rather than women's bodies being like an object that you can access, she made them somewhat inaccessible in a way that actually parallels the way that she um, presented herself, right, in her writings. And that is interesting from a feminist perspective, right, because it's a refusal of access, right? And if we think about women as always being objects of a gaze, right, that are meant to penetrate them and get at them, I kind of, designing clothes that are confusing, that are hard to get into, as some of them were, all of that kind of thing. It's a pushing away of a gaze. So it actually refuses a lot of ways that femininity is tended to be constructed.
Let's talk about Dior.
Sure, I like talking about Dior.
I watch their commercials a lot. It's so cinematic. It's just
Mhm.
really beautiful to watch. Everything about their brand feels really, how do I describe it? Like it's very florally, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
very dreamy, kind of like nostalgic a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a lot of floral influences, which I really like and is really pleasing to the
Mhm.
eye. I was wondering if you can tell me a little more about the branding process back then and Christian Dior's story as well.
Sure. So Dior was born in the 1890s in Normandy, and then he moved in his 20s to Paris and became an artist and was hanging around with um, arty people
Mhm.
and got his start working for another designer in another designer's fashion house, and became really well known right after World War II. So his first collection was in 1947, and why he made such a splash was because what he proposed was going back to an earlier model of femininity in a sense, an earlier silhouette. So actually some of the lines in his first collections look very much like they come from the mid to late 19th century, well, about the 1860s, for example. And he says this very explicitly that he wants to go back to a more beautiful, what he considers a more beautiful femininity. So that's interesting. And it's great to pick up on the florals and that kind of thing, because that really fits with what he was trying to do in the very, very beginning. So there's a way in which I think the brand has held on to some of those early associations that are now, however many decades old that is, 80 years old. The brand is still holding on to them. So yeah, that's how he made his name. And what's also notable about him is, as you asked me to talk about the branding, he was one of the first people to license his name to other kinds of products, right? Where you can get Dior like nylon stockings, you can get Dior ties, you can get Dior perfume, all of these kinds of things. I mean, there were other people that did perfume, but he loaned his name and his cachet and his reputation to these other items, and he made money from that. They would give that made revenue for him. Um, so it's an interesting study in um, really effective branding that's like a much broader strategy than just the clothes themselves.
I see. And apparently he was a gardener too,
He
right?
was, he was. He had a beautiful garden at his summer home. He really had, and he was trying to do like old school gardening too. And he decorated his home, his summer home, in an 18th century way. I have an article about his gardening and home aesthetics as well. So yeah, he had a particular kind of backward looking aesthetic sense. He's an odd duck. He's very nostalgic. He is, not somebody on many levels that I should like, but I find there's something appealing about him.
Can you go a little more into that? Is this
About him.
is the businessman side of him kind of thing?
That's not the businessman side, or that is.
Or both. Both works.
I find him I think I have a bit of sympathy for him because he feels like a person from another age who was stuck in his age. It seemed like he wanted to be in the 18th and 19th century, given all his aesthetic choices. Um, and so there's a bit of a tragic kind of aura about him, but that actually also worked really to his advantage as a business person, right? Because it came at this time when he came up at a time when people were for a time before the horrifying war they'd just lived through, right? So it did seem to be something deeply held in him, but it worked to sell a vision as well.
See. Um, is there, where did it go? Are there any of his ideologies, narratives, or traces of his vision that you notice in the present, whether it be in fashion or just in Western culture and society in general?
I don't know how much of a stretch it is to say that I probably find something of the tradwife. Uh, yeah, which I
Ooh,
can't. I know, yeah, which is not. I'm not. Which is I'm not a fan of.
yeah.
But because he had this kind of backward-looking interest in aesthetic traditionalism, that's what we see with tradwives as well. So I think there's a bit of we could probably trace a little bit of a line. It would be interesting to do that, to think about that through the decades since Dior made his mark in the 1947 until now. Yeah.
Out of like, can you compare all the three designers that we just talked about and their impact on fashion?
Mm, it's a great question. I think that, and we can think about this in a kind of stepped historical way. Poiret was first. He did something that looked on the surface like it was revolutionizing something, although it wasn't particularly. We had Schiaparelli, who I think did do something quite revolutionary, actually, with her constructions, her refusals of the gaze, her strategic opacity that she designed into a lot of the clothes she made, the confusion and the illegibility. That is actually quite revolutionary. And then you have Dior, who is refusing all of that and doesn't want it and says, I think he even does say this, the revolution is to go backward. Um, so you've got a kind of set of different perspectives on radical change, I would say.
So, another question that I have. Your work on Poiret and Schiaparelli highlights how identity is strategically constructed from the outside, but in your newer book, you pivot towards the internal somatic experience of dress. I want to look at how these two ideas intersect. So when we strategically rebrand ourselves or glow up from the outside, what do you think is happening to us internally? Like, are we exercising genuine agency over our identity, or are these aesthetic shifts just coping mechanisms for surviving a capitalist trap?
I think it's probably the latter, but that
Mhm.
doesn't mean it's not important. I
Mhm.
mean, it's difficult for there to be, I can't say that there's pure agency in the world. That's why we all look sort of similar in this culture, right? We have a set of aesthetic reference, and we have a common language and a set of ideologies that really contribute to how we wear our clothes and self-fashion, right?
Mhm.
Um, so we are exercising what we would call constrained agency. We are, it's not like we have no agency, but there is constraint on our agency. And a lot of the choices that we make are made under a kind of duress. Um, but that does not mean that we don't get something internal from them, right? That we don't feel better for them. And I would never say that that is, a false feeling or anything like that. I would just acknowledge that our feelings are, as you put it so beautifully there, our somatic experiences, our internal experiences are deeply, deeply shaped and constructed by the social milieus that we're in. That's all. But it doesn't mean that our feelings of our feeling good about ourselves, say, is inauthentic.
So I want to hear your stance on this. Um,
Mhm.
from your perspective, how do you think, or you've kind of already answered this, but how do you think we should approach the notion of glowing up? Because based on everything we've discussed so far, um, glow ups, self-improvements are supposed to be empowering because it allows one to reclaim agency over their identity and lifestyle. But then, kind of like at the end of the day, if you're just fitting yourself into a mold that society or capitalism pre-constructed for you for larger agendas that we may not be aware of, um, what do you think we should do about that?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a huge question. I don't think we should, the answer is not to say, I'm not going to care about my appearance.
Mhm.
I think that it's people's feelings of care for their appearance are real. Um, but we might become more aware of the structures that bring us those feelings, right? Just like you're doing. I mean, it seems to me you've had a bit of a shift in the way you're thinking about this because you're learning, right? So if everybody did some of this learning and came to understand the field of influences that is shaping our desires to glow up and all of that kind of thing, that would be one thing I would hope would shift people's thinking about it a little bit because people are really attached to an idea that they have completely free choice. And so once they realize that their choices, well, they are choices, are constructed in this constrained way, that might get them to start rethinking things. A glow up is about is about one person alone, and it's like you in your bathroom or you doing whatever styling things you're doing as a singular person. But we're creatures who are related to other people and things and institutions and animals and all of these kinds of things. So thinking about how our glow ups fit in a larger context of the relations in which we are nested, I think is really important. And that might lead us to start to realize how our labor of glowing up is related to other labor that, say, other women do, like nail salon workers, say, who might be underpaid, but who we go to for our glow ups, right?